The night of March 28, 1796, was a sleepless one for General Napoleon Bonaparte. After finalising the terms of the Armistice of Cherasco, he'd stayed up until dawn, discussing history and strategy with Savoy generals. Already, riders were carrying the day's orders out to divisional commanders. The forces holding the Alpine passes were to converge on Cherasco. Napoleon also requested 10,000 reinforcements be brought in from the Army of the Alps, fully half of General Kellerman's force. The rest of the 29th was spent looting and pillaging. Only La Harpe's division made any progress, driving hard on Acqui. However, before the town was taken, his division began to mutiny. This was the result of days of hard fighting and hard marching. The delay derailed Napoleon's plans to trap the Austrian army. By now, he had received word that Beaulieu was evacuating Piedmont. The fortress at Alessandria was abandoned as the 25,000 or so Austrians raced east, towards the relative safety of Lombardy. Acqui fell on the 30th, a day too late to ensnare Beaulieu. Napoleon made his headquarters in Acqui on the 1st of May, and found his calculations quite drastically altered, as he now had to contemplate another long campaign not dissimilar to the one he'd just completed. The Po River presented an obstacle not unlike the Alps, in that there were only a few ways across, and they were all well defended. The first crossing was at Valenza. Not only was this the most direct route, but as per Cherasco, the French had right of access. Helpfully, the Piedmontese had even provided bridging supplies for French use. However, it was here that the bulk of Beaulieu's army was concentrated. So another option was just south of Pavia. Here there was a usable bridge, but it faced the same problem as Valenza, namely that the Austrians would be able to quickly concentrate should the French break through. By now, Kellerman had reluctantly given up his 2 divisions, bringing Napoleon's strength up to about 40,000. But this slight numerical edge was not enough to intimidate Beaulieu. Moreover, the supply situation, though much ameliorated, was far from ideal. The Army of Italy's lines of supply and communication now ran through Sardinia-Piedmont, and there was no binding peace treaty yet in place. Adding on to this, the growing apprehension from the Directory, and the occasional mutiny among the troops, time was not on Napoleon's side as he weighed his options. There was a third crossing he gave serious consideration to, the crossing at Piacenza. Piacenza was a possession of the Duchy of Parma. A crossing here would allow Napoleon to completely outflank Beaulieu, and quite possibly block his retreat altogether. On May 1st, Napoleon demanded from his embassy in Genoa a memorandum detailing the topography, history, and location of valuables for these duchies. For good measure, he also ordered 6,000 more boots and another 15 million francs to be extorted from the Genovese. Money, indeed, was becoming an ever more acute problem. Mutiny in the Army of Italy was largely the result of pay arrears, and the Directory made incessant demands for bullion and fine art. With this in mind, Napoleon was open to making peace with Modena and Parma if only they would pay large indemnities and allow him to cross at Piacenza. The Duke of Parma, Ferdinando de Bourbon, a relation of the guillotined Louis XVI, was open to the idea even if it did mean parting with a few million francs and all of his fine art. Though an Austrian ally, the French were on Ferdinando's doorstep, menacing his towns. Surrender, like that at Cherasco, was a favourable alternative to conquest. Of the 3 crossings, Napoleon selected Piacenza. From the 1st to the 6th, he prepositioned forces along the Po River. A cavalry screen was held along the length of the river to prevent Beaulieu's scouts from reporting on Napoleon's concentrations. He sent word of his plan back to the Directory on the 6th. Yesterday, we were cannonading the Austrians beyond the Po. This river is wide and very difficult to cross. My plan is to make a crossing as near to Milan as possible. Today, we march on Piacenza. Pavia will find itself turned, and if the enemy determines to hold that town, I will be placed between them and their depots. If I were to wait for pontoon bridges, I am certain that we should not get over until July. To suffice, we will make good use of rafts and flying bridges. A rapid crossing at Piacenza would take the Austrians by surprise, but there did remain the issue of them concentrating forces on the bridgehead. Speed could only take Napoleon so far if it was not aided by a bit of trickery. So on the 5th, Massena and Serrurier began probing attacks at Valenza. These had the desired effect, as Beaulieu was lulled into believing that this would be where the French made their crossing. In fact, he was so thoroughly fooled that he began to retire towards the Ticino. However, he did leave a full infantry company and supporting cavalry under the command of General Anton Lipthay to hold the area around Pavia. The actual full-strength French assault began at 9 AM on the 6th. A special detachment under the command of General de Division Claude Delamain forced their way across the Po. This force was comprised of 3,600 fur-capped grenadiers and 2,500 light cavalry. The grenadiers went first, led personally by intrepid young Jean Lannes. He continued to impress. Having spent hours scouring the river for boats and bridging materials, he eventually spotted a ferry large enough to convey 500 men in one trip. In short order, Law was the first to land on the Po's opposite bank. After light skirmishing, the bridgehead was secured, and La Harpe's division began to cross in force. They were over by the late afternoon. It was at this point, where the French began to advance, that proper resistance was encountered. Lepte's troops held the roads leading east to his headquarters at Fombio. As afternoon gave way to night, his troops came away second best in skirmishing with Lannes's grenadiers and Beaumont's cavalry. Reinforcements from La Harpe decisively broke Lepte. He retreated to Fombio on the 7th. A defeat for Lepte would be disastrous for Beaulieu. His entire defensive strategy had anticipated a crossing at Valenza. If the French broke Fombio, they'd have free rein to sever his lines of supply and communication back to Vienna. To prevent this, he called up Croatian-born General Josip Vukasovic, a reliable and pragmatic officer. Commanding a division of around 4,500 infantry, Vukasovic's orders were to race towards Fombio and bail out Lepte. He departed Versagio late on the 7th, with Beaulieu and Karl Bottendorf not far behind. By now, though, the French were well and truly across the Po. Indeed, Augereau was at the very moment fording the river a little ways west of Piacenza at the village of Oreto. Before long, Napoleon and his staff were also across. Vukasovic was too late to save Lepte from defeat. After an exhausting night march, his columns collided with Lepte's retreating Austrians and La Harpe's advance. Fighting a rearguard action, Vukasovic and other Austrian elements did manage to check La Harpe at the village of Codogno on the night of the 8th. French casualties entering the village were heavy, but once they were in, they had the measure of the Austrians. However, in confused nighttime and street-to-street fighting, La Harpe was killed, shot dead by his own men. The French momentum floundered. At this point, General Berthier took command. He was on scene ostensibly to restore some command and control for Napoleon, but found it necessary to make tactical arrangements. 2 demi-brigades reinforced Codogno, and by morning, the Austrians were on their heels. The Battle of Fombio proved a consequential French victory. There was now not only enough time for Massena and Serrurieux's divisions to cross the Po, but Beaulieu abandoned all hope of halting the French offensive and was instead in full flight eastward. Napoleon had played little tactical role in the battle, letting his skilled subordinates do the heavy lifting. He'd spent the 7th negotiating with representatives of the Duke of Parma, with whom a tentative peace was signed. Piacenza initially refused to observe the peace, barring the French from their town. Before long, Napoleon was upon them, his cannons arrayed menacingly around their walls. Rather than face bombardment, Piacenza submitted, the payoff being that every horse in town was requisitioned by the French. Indeed, the French artillery was now pulled along by the thoroughbreds of the Piacenza nobility. Now that the French were across the Po, Napoleon faced 2 choices. The road to Milan lay wide open, and he could simply take the city. On the other hand, Beaulieu's army was still intact. If Napoleon could pull off another maneuver sur le derrière, a maneuver behind Beaulieu, and bring him to battle, he might be able to deliver a crushing defeat on the Austrian army. For his part, Napoleon spared no thought to taking wealthy Milan, as would have been the Directory's wishes. Rather, Napoleon recalled his divisional commanders, ordering them to converge on him. From there, he ordered them east. Flying columns force marched towards the town of Lodi, which straddled the Adda River some 22 miles southeast of Milan. Though contending with Vukasovic on the road during the night, Dalemain arrived in Lodi in force on the morning of the 10th. An hour or so later, Napoleon arrived on scene. He was deeply disappointed to find his army too late to prevent Beaulieu's crossing the River Adda. As the French lines drew up, around 2/3 of the Austrians were already across Lodi's narrow wooden bridge. Only the 10,000-man rearguard remained, commanded by Bottendorf. 3 battalions of infantry were established in the buildings on either side of the river. Another 8 infantry battalions and 14 cavalry squadrons were kept in reserve to prevent a breakthrough. In support were 12 cannons, 6 on the Adda's eastern bank overlooking the bridge, the other 6 on the western bank where they were to provide direct fire on either side of Lodi's main road. Dalemain's advance guard quickly overwhelmed the Austrian pickets and occupied Lodi's outlying buildings. They advanced street by street, until by afternoon they were at the river's edge. At this point, Napoleon came up to assess their progress. His first order was for Marmont and Colonel Marc Beaumont to take several cavalry squadrons northwest and seek out a crossing. After that, he undertook a scouting mission of the enemy's defences, determining that every effort had to be made to take the bridge. Though the Austrians were well positioned, Napoleon needed to make an immediate attack, or risk Bottendorf withdrawing that night. The initial assault would be difficult, however, possibly even suicidal, considering the proximity of Austrian cannons, which could hurl shot down the length of the bridge. Suppressing these batteries would be key, so Napoleon took the time to position each of his 24 guns along the length of the Adda, finishing by 5 in the afternoon. There was no time to build earthworks, so the batteries were established in the streets or on the banks, under constant Austrian fire. But once the French guns began to roar, it was the Austrians who felt the heat. They were similarly exposed, and now outnumbered by the better French cannon, decisively lost the artillery duel. With fire superiority his, Napoleon could attempt a crossing. He arranged an assault column comprised of grenadiers and volunteers from Lens and Cervoni's brigades. This force was around 3,500 strong, and they were about to crash headlong into the teeth of Zobottendorf's defence. Sensitive to the peril they faced, Napoleon delivered a stirring speech. Then the cannons, under Berthier's command, were ordered to fire double time. Under this covering fire, a Colonel Dupart led his Chasseurs Cheval squadron on a thunder run down the bridge. Grape shot tearing through their ranks, Austrian fire harrowing. Dupart didn't get far, but he did focus attention away from the main column, which followed in his wake. Colours held high, their officers leading from the front. The assault column advanced down the Lodi Bridge. The Po is a wide and fast-flowing river. Lodi's bridge was at a narrow point, but still spanned about 150 metres. As they pressed down this choke point, the assault column was the focus of Austrian fire. Amidst a whirlwind of fire and shrapnel, their vision obscured by heavy smoke, the French column gained ground. But once they reached around the halfway point, where the smoke was clearing, renewed Austrian fire stalled the attack. Watching on from the bank, Napoleon could see the momentum ebb. Other units were put into the attack, but it was not enough. At this critical moment, André Massena joined Napoleon. He had the advanced elements of his own division on hand and rushed them into the attack. Though exhausted after days of fighting and marching, Massena's division displayed incredible zeal. Their timely arrival revived flagging morale, and the column renewed its attack. Massena, Cervoni, Delamain, Berthier and Lannes all took to the bridge at various points to exhort the men. By around 7 p.m, the first grenadiers were across. They leapt from the bridge onto the shore, from where they spread out. Further firing erupted from the bridge itself, where lines of fusiliers rained metal on the Austrians below. At the head of the column, grenadiers collided with the Austrian central position. A bloody bayonet melee ensued, in which the Austrian infantry abandoned their forward defence. Hundreds of French troops were now across, thousands more behind them. Though the battle was all but lost at this point, Zobottendorf made one last attempt to thwart the French. He deployed his immense reserve, a force that, on paper, vastly outnumbered the French column. But in the confines of the streets, and blasted apart by cannon fire, the Austrian counterattack spluttered to a halt. They did manage to drive the French back to the bridgehead, but failed to push them back across the bridge. Augereau arrived soon thereafter, and as though that wasn't enough, Zobottendorf received word that French cavalry were in the rear. Beaumont had made his crossing, and now threatened to cut off the retreat. The battle thoroughly lost, Zobottendorf made his escape, taking full advantage of the onset of night. Ferocious fighting had extracted a heavy toll. Napoleon had lost several hundred dead and wounded at Lodi, with Delamain's brigade having borne the brunt. Similar numbers had been lost in the days prior. However, in the cruel arithmetic of war, these losses were far fewer than would have been suffered in a longer campaign. Rather than trade lives for ground in a more traditional, slower-paced campaign, Napoleon made forced marches and daring attacks that kept Beaulieu off balance. The Austrian defence was reactive, and so the initiative was Napoleon's to do with as he pleased. Exhausted though they were, the French officers and men revelled, accepting that a few days of hard fighting and marching were the cost of defeating an enemy so decisively. And the results at Lodi spoke well of Napoleon's strategy. After a hasty retreat, Zobottendorf was forced to leave behind many stragglers, as well as all of his cannon. The French took 1,700 prisoners, having killed around 150 in the attack. This was a pretty clear-cut victory for the French. But Napoleon was less than pleased with the results. Beaulieu had escaped, so other battles lay ahead. Napoleon did, however, console himself in the knowledge that this was a unique victory. The outnumbered French had outfought an experienced enemy who occupied an excellent position. In the face of this enemy, they'd made an audacious river crossing and carried the day. As the smoke cleared and night fell, spirits among the French were high. Trust between officers and men had been galvanized in the heat of battle. There were no cowards here. Courageous Massena, the dashing Lannes, and that brave bastard La Harpe were forever endeared to their men. Napoleon was vaunted too. After the battle, as the French were making their bivouacs and cooking their meals, Napoleon rode around camp. Grenadiers from Lannes' brigade rose to greet him. As a token of their esteem, they bestowed upon Napoleon that most generous gift a soldier can give, a good nickname. Courageous, clever, and sharing the hardships of his men, Napoleon was nicknamed Le Petit Corporal, the Little Corporal. This was an honour that Napoleon cherished. For the remainder of the campaign, the loyalty of his troops was never in doubt. The army's sights were now set on the crown jewel of Lombardy, the capital city of Milan. But before setting out, there was some housekeeping to do. An urgent message from Paris informed Napoleon that his reinforcements were soon to arrive. However, the order stipulated a catch: that command of the army of Italy was to be shared between both Napoleon and Kellerman. Napoleon would stay in Lombardy while Kellerman plundered his way down to Rome. There can be no doubt that military expedient was not a factor in the decision. The Directory believed that Napoleon's rising star was a threat. But Napoleon had powerful friends, and now a serious victory to his name. So when, on the 14th, he dispatched a response, his words carried weight. "I think it unwise to divide the army of Italy in two. It is against the interest of the Republic to give it two generals. The move on Rome is only a trifling matter. The true contention is that there should be only one general, unfettered in his judgment and operations. I have conducted this campaign without consultation. I should have done no good if guided by another's opinions. I've had some measure of success because my moves have been as quick as my thoughts. If you put shackles on me, expect poor results. General Kellerman has longer experience and will command the army as well as I, but he and I together will surely falter. I believe that one bad general is better than two good ones. War, like government, is a matter of tact." As was so often the case, there was a wisdom in Napoleon's words far beyond his years. Decisions made in Paris could never be as beneficial as those made on the ground, and a divided command, where two conflicting opinions precluded unity of purpose, were surefire ways to doom the thus far brilliant Italian campaign. Nonetheless, Napoleon was quick to allay fears that his refusal to abide Kellerman was the work of a hothead, adding an addendum, quote, "It requires great courage to write you this letter. Do not accuse me of ambition or pride." To make this pill go down a little easier, another large convoy of plunder was sent Paris's way. As it was, the Directory's orders were pretty toothless, and quickly overturned by Les Carnot, leaving Napoleon to focus on the campaign. On May 13th, Massena's division reached the outskirts of Milan. Without a shot, the city was occupied, with only a small Austrian garrison lingering on in the citadel. 2 days later, as church bells rang out above the city, Napoleon, at the head of the army of Italy, made a triumphant entry. They were greeted with offerings of flowers and food, gifts meant to appease conquerors. The Milanese feared what this hungry army might do if there was resistance, the sack of the Mondovi plains casting a grave shadow over otherwise enthusiastic celebrations. Apprehension as to French intentions were greatest among the Milanese nobility, who pulled out all the stops to impress Napoleon. The Duke of Serbelloni invited him to stay in his own palace, where Napoleon established his headquarters. He expected to stay in Milan maybe a few days. Hell, he reported to Carnot that he'd be in Vienna within 20 days. But of course, Napoleon was not so fortunate as all that. The first order of business was ousting the remnants of Austrian imperialism, namely all of their appointees and their institutions. Elections were held to find replacements, and Napoleon vetted the candidates carefully. They were chosen exclusively from among Milan's liberals, self-described patriots who stirred for an independent Milanese republic. They would get their wish. A day after his arrival, Napoleon proclaimed the formation of the Lombardic Republic, also called the Cisabardine Republic. Emulating their French benefactors, a national guard was hastily formed, Napoleon selecting green for their uniforms. Likewise, the Italians adopted the tricolour as their own, swapping out the blue for green. Since he had no intention of staying, Napoleon happily elevated an outspoken liberal, Francesco de Eril, and gave him the presidency of the nascent republic. For the time being, Milan, and Italy more generally, were conquered lands. Though annexed into the nominally independent sister republics and administered by locals, Italy would exist as a French client state. And for now, that meant offering up their riches to sustain the French war effort. Agent on mission Antonio Salicetti levied 20 million francs from the Milanese. The Dukes of Parma and Modena were also forced to fork over tremendous sums. Gold and silver was carted off to Paris, along with dozens of priceless artifacts and works of art, the cultural wealth of Italy used to enrich France. Indeed, the Directory specifically sought out such treasures. The largest shipment was sent only a few days prior, on the 9th. Quote, "I am sending you 20 pictures by the great masters, Correggio and Michelangelo," reported Napoleon to Carnot. This fine art was to be housed in the recently established Louvre Museum, and some still reside there to this day. By May 17th, Napoleon reported to the Directory, The tricolour flag waves above Milan, Pavia, Como, and all the cities of Lombardy. Orders are issued to equip the divisions with all they need to resume active operations, and carry them out with the rapidity and dash that have so far delivered us victory. Napoleon was confident that he could leave soon, but issues kept cropping up. A delay of 1 day stretched out to 3. In that time, Napoleon made clear his intentions towards Italy. At this stage, they were benign. He wanted free and independent sister republics to thrive. But he also recognised that the political culture of Italy was far less advanced than that back in France. France had been a republic for 4 years, and steeped in revolution for even longer. The Italians who now came to the fore were liberals, to be sure, but still, at the end of the day, far from unified. We say Italians, but at this stage there was no such thing. There was a Venetian, a Lombard, a Neapolitan. Risorgimento and Italian unification are 70-odd years away. Here in the 1790s was the beta test. Overcoming Italian parochialism and reforming their feudal institutions was not something Napoleon could achieve in 3 days, though he did make a credible attempt. Sweeping liberal and revolutionary reforms were enacted, overhauling the judiciary, eliminating mercantilism, nationalising church land, enforcing equality, and abolishing feudalism. These reforms were accepted by the middle and upper classes as being for the best, certainly better than Austrian systems. But the common people were less than convinced. They were deeply suspicious of French interlopers, and reforms like the abolition of feudalism, attendant dues and tithes would have obvious long-term benefits, but did, in the short term, create quite a bit of resentment. Religion played a deleterious role too. Catholic priests declaimed the French as atheists, calling upon the peasantry to resist. They also excited anti-Semitic tensions, as Napoleon abolished the ghettos and laws prescribing usury. These growing tensions simmered just below the surface. That a revolt was brewing was plain for all to see, but Napoleon missed the storm clouds. His focus was on restoring order to the army, which had descended into something of a haze, looting Lombardy's wealthy cities. Not wanting to resort to executions as at Mondovì, Napoleon instead employed the carrot, paying off the army's pay arrears in hard currency, a very welcome change. Next, on the 20th of May, he gave yet another inspiring speech, and had it disseminated throughout the ranks. Soldiers, you have rolled down from the Apennines like a torrent. You have overthrown and scattered all that opposed your advance. Milan is yours, and the Republican tricolour is draped over Lombardy. The Po, the Ticino, the Adda could not hold you back for even a day. Yes, soldiers, you have accomplished much. But is there nothing left to do? A torpid pose is tedious to you. The days that are lost to glory are days robbed of happiness. Come, onwards. We have more forced marches to make, more enemies to vanquish, more laurels to win, more wrongs against France which in battle we shall avenge. On the 21st of May, the Directory officially made peace with Saint-Denis-Piedmont. With rear lines guaranteed by treaty, the army of Italy left Milan in their dust. However, the French departure was ill-timed. As though at the drop of a hat, Lombardy erupted in revolt. The epicenter was Pavia, where the local town council declared against the new republic and forced surrender of their French garrison. In the countryside, Catholic priests invade the peasantry to resist. Only hours after the flare-up, Napoleon arrived with his 30,000 men. Immediately sensing that this rebellion was no mere isolated incident, he had to act decisively. Napoleon sent Berthier on ahead with most of the army, around 28,000 men, while he himself reeled around and retraced the steps back to Milan. The going was slow, but he was back in Milan early on the 24th. Unlike at Pavia, Milan was largely secured by General Despeigneux. Napoleon ordered Despeigneux to try and execute all those captured under arms. Within hours, Napoleon was back on the move. Again, he faced unexpected delays. At the village of Binasco, only 10 miles southwest of Milan, the rebels had formed an ad hoc defence. Barricades were built, pitchforks and muskets levelled. Having just stared down Hungarian grenadiers and Croat riflemen, the French soldiers were hardly threatened by some villagers. In a brief and wholly one-sided affair, Binasco was captured. As a message to other rebel towns and villages, Napoleon ordered the settlement torched. He didn't linger long amidst the embers. Only hours later, he arrived back in Pavia, only to find the city well and truly out of French control. A vanguard of 1,500 men stormed the city gates, and then put Pavia to the sword. Again, Napoleon let the men run rampant, determined to let the lessons of Pavia and Binasco dampen rebellious spirits. To further ensure compliance, Napoleon ordered the taking of over 500 hostages from among the sons and daughters of the Lombard nobility. But this scarcely affected the flames of rebellion, as the revolts were largely organised by the disgruntled clergy. Particularly stubborn clerical intransigence around Tortona was stamped out only after Napoleon had the region's church bells melted down and the ringleaders shot. The brutal episode that is the short-lived Lombard Revolt scarcely factors into most discussions of Napoleon's life. At most, it merits a mention. But it must be noted that this is not Napoleon's first rodeo, and it could be said he had a lot more experience in crushing revolts than leading armies. Those formative experiences he'd had on the wrong side of an angry mob had instilled in him a genuine fear that populist revolts, when they got going, imperiled order. Order had to be maintained for the safety of all, and so Napoleon's solution, his, quote, medicine as he later described, was extreme and uncompromising violence. In his memoirs and in later years, Napoleon would regret his brutality in Lombardy, but he did not disavow those methods. The logic was that if through leniency such revolts grew out of hand, the loss of life and suffering would be magnitudes greater than that of immediate repression. Violence, however abhorrent, he believed was preferable to disorder. A resort to violence was not the sole lesson Napoleon drew, however. Reinforced was his conception that institutions kept people in line, even institutions he personally disdained. Going forward, Napoleon felt that the church and the nobility had to be at least somewhat catered to, lest they again derail his plans. Having put down the revolt, Napoleon rejoined Berthier on the 28th in the city of Brescia. Though the campaign could now resume, the delay caused by the Lombard revolt had played into Austrian hands. Beaulieu had managed to rein in his panicked retreat and form defences along the river Mincio. Reinforced to 28,000 strong, and close to the resupply hub at Mantua, his position was technically very strong. Against a slow and traditional opponent, perhaps Beaulieu might have stood a chance, but Napoleon was hyper-aggressive and would give Beaulieu no time to consolidate. By comparison to the wide and rapid Po, the Mincio was a cupcake, less than half the width and nowhere near as fast-flowing. Napoleon scouts reported that at the village of Borghetto, there was a crossing and minimal enemy presence. On the 30th, Napoleon made a crossing in force. At first he sent forth the cavalry to scout out the enemy positions, then a cloud of skirmishers. And it's here that the vaunted French light infantry earned their keep. Positioned on the wooded shoreline of the western bank, the sharpshooters picked apart fully arrayed Austrian regiments. In vain did the Austrians reply with volley fire, which failed to inflict even a single casualty. Covered by the skirmishers, the French grenadiers waded through the Mincio and seized Borghetto. The Austrians fled, leaving behind several dozen dead and wounded. They also left behind other, more thoughtful gifts, 5 more cannons, and fully stocked ambulances full of bandages and stretchers. Once across and fully formed up, Napoleon ordered his divisions out on separate but supportive assignments. Augereau was sent towards the fortress at Peschiera, while Massena captured Verona without incident. Serdurio got the tough job and headed east, directly towards Mantua. On June 1st, Napoleon was leading La Harpe's former division and went forward to personally scout out the town of Valeggio. In so doing, he strayed a little too close to some Austrian cavalry. They gave chase, and only narrowly did Napoleon escape. All was well in the end, the only casualty being a booty left behind in the struggle. Elsewhere, Napoleon's divisions made excellent progress. Their progress was so rapid that Beaulieu ordered a full retreat. Except this time, with the French on his heels, the retreat was horribly disorganised. Zebotendorf's division of around 4,500 men was split off from the main force. As Beaulieu fled to the Trentino Valley, Zebotendorf took refuge in Mantua. For this latest failure, the Aulic Council had Beaulieu demoted. Dagobert von Wurmser assumed overall command. On June 2nd, Napoleon arrived at the outskirts of Mantua, joining his advanced columns which had arrived on May 31st. They had already tried and failed to outright secure the fortress, but got nowhere. Reluctantly, Napoleon gave the order to dig siege lines. Though he would have preferred to ignore Mantua and avoid the messy business of a protracted siege, the strategic picture was not so permissive. The combined numbers of Mantua's 12,000-man garrison and Zebotendorf's division left around 1,700 men in the fortress, and so just behind Napoleon's front line. A siege was necessary, but the many months it would take was time Napoleon simply didn't have for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Venetians, who were nominally independent, were under serious diplomatic pressure to permit their lands be used by the Austrians for a counter-offensive. As the days went by, Venetian neutrality frayed. Second, the Directory was ever desperate for loot, and again insisted that Napoleon basically abandon his eastward thrust, and instead plunge south into the Papal States and then on to Naples. And the third problem was particularly unfortunate. The Lombard revolt was flaring up again. On the 5th, Tortona, Pozzolo, and Arquata tore down their tricolours. Now Napoleon's lines back to France were threatened as he faced the daunting prospect of fending off a massive Austrian counterattack along the Adige, whilst at the same time reducing rock-solid Mantua. If ever there was a man up to the task, it was Napoleon. His first move was to begin the siege of Mantua. Though the army of Italy was now up to over 40,000 in number, these forces he was obliged to disperse, and he began the siege with maybe 10,000 men. Not that it would have mattered much. Mantua would be a nightmare to take. Girded by lakes and marshland, protected by thick, sharply angled walls, and bristling with over 300 cannons, Mantua was the European fortress par excellence. French fire literally bounced off of the walls, and was always answered with a hail of return fire. Inside, stocks of food and ammunition were plentiful, and water was readily available. The fortress wouldn't fall anytime soon. Nonetheless, at least initially, things looked promising. After the failed initial assault, Augereau and Serrurier reinforced the besiegers on June 3rd. Jeanlin, for what must be the fourth time now, personally led his grenadiers in an attack. Through sheer audacity, they captured the Fort St. George on the northern lake. However, this was the extent of good news, as the siege took on a familiar static pose. Only heavy guns might break the equilibrium, but the French had none, having left their heavy artillery back in France so as to maintain a brisk marching pace. For 3 days, Napoleon oversaw the opening of the siege, noting in his reports how proud he was of the army's conduct. "I could not name all the soldiers who have distinguished themselves for courage. Nothing could be equal to their bravery. You would suppose that once at bivouac, they would at least rest, but nothing of the sort. Every man set to work, or drawing up the next day's plans of operations." Also included was a notice that 100 horse-drawn carriages, quote, "the finest in Lombardy," would replace those currently in service. The old ones would be sent back to France, carrying over 2 million francs worth of loot. As had been the case for weeks, the French occupation proved lucrative. By June 5th, Napoleon and Lannes were back in Milan, having spent the day dousing the last rebel hotspots. That night, residing again in the Palazzo di Serbelloni, Napoleon was accosted by the diplomats of his various enemies. Only days before, on May 28th, a Venetian deputation had visited Napoleon to negotiate some sort of truce. In what was probably a bluff, Napoleon threatened to march on Venice should the Serene Republic decline to contribute a large indemnity to the French. The Venetian deputation took these terms back to the Doge, along with Napoleon's assurances that, regardless of what happened next, he would respect Venetian lives and property. Fearing the French far more than the Austrians, the Venetians paid their tribute and escaped invasion, for now at least. Tuscany was on the verge of capitulating, as were the Neapolitans. Presently, it was only the Neapolitans who were actively engaged against the French. 4 cavalry squadrons rode with Wurmser, and their fleet bolstered Horatio Nelson's squadron. Napoleon was under strict orders not to make peace with either the Tuscans or the Neapolitans. The Directory was singular in their demands that the papal treasury be emptied, and whilst down south, Napoleon might as well crack open the Neapolitan and Tuscan treasuries. However, as Napoleon was not at the head of a Hunnic host, and in fact had a war to win, he refused to play the Directory's game. As with the Venetians, if through negotiations he could get what he wanted, he'd hash it out. But that didn't mean he'd play nice. That very night, the 5th of June, the Neapolitan ambassador was given a treaty and told to sign. Otherwise, the French would invade that morning. The ambassador signed. Despite now sharing a perilously unguarded frontier with the French, both Tuscany and the Papal States held out. Though Tuscany wavered, they followed the Pope's lead, and Pope Pius VI was not giving in to atheists and bandits. Since at least 1791, he'd been a loudmouthed opponent of the revolution. Serrurier was left to continue the siege of Mantua, while Augereau and Napoleon launched a lightning raid down through Romagna and into Campania. Lannes' brigade formed the advanced guard, and Marat screened him with cavalry. On June 18th, they cut a swath through Modena, and the next day were on the outskirts of Bologna. Haggard battalions of the Papal Army made their only act of defiance at Fort Urban. But the swarms of blue-cloaked French fusiliers, streaming into Bologna below, convinced the defenders to desert. Hundreds surrendered, giving up their forts and, importantly, their heavy guns. For this, they received humane treatment. Bologna, too, was largely spared. Since the city had surrendered quickly, and since Napoleon had no desire to spark another revolt, he limited the army's looting to only official treasuries and art collections. And they went about it in a very systematic way. Art historians and other experts accompanied Napoleon, and they went about selecting which art was to be carted off to Paris. And in an interesting early nod to his appreciation for scientific advancement, Napoleon had a wide selection of snakes packed up. Weeks earlier too, in Milan, he'd inspected their observatory and actively conferred with eminent scientists. Among the bounty from Bologna was the papal legate. He was escorted to Rome, Napoleon's terms in hand. Pius was pragmatic enough to capitulate on the 26th. The conditions were harsh. At first, the papal state offered some money and food. Napoleon refused and held out for the entire papal treasury of 30 million francs, as well as all their art. Here, he was outmaneuvered by the legate, who discerned from the agents on mission that Napoleon did not intend to occupy Rome, as the Pope had feared. This emboldened the legate to haggle down to 15 million. Not a little bit miffed, Napoleon threatened to occupy Ravenna and told the legate to pound sand. But by now quite chummy with the agents, the legate refused to budge. The French only got 15 million, but did have run-of-the-mill to scour the papal archives and art collections. Napoleon's disappointment, conveyed in letters back to Paris, seems to have been performative. Sometime around the 20th, spies in the Austrian General Staff reported Wurmser was ordered to attack out of Tyrolia. Scouts confirmed heavy Austrian movement in the area. Napoleon wanted nothing more than to quickly reduce Mantua. Any more time spent dallying about in Campania might prove disastrous. Retracing his path back north, Napoleon was back in Verona by July 9th. Already he deposited the 40 captured Bolognese cannon with Augereau, with which to batter the fortress into submission. But more guns and ammunition were desperately sought. Most of what Augereau needed, Napoleon had preemptively ordered hauled up from Nice to Milan, but the going was tough. There were not enough animals to haul all the carriages, and even if there were, as at Toulon, the French government had not deigned to provide any gun crews. Help was at hand, however. Already we're pretty familiar with Napoleon's deep bench of talented senior officers, but of course there were plenty of junior officers who were equally as talented and ambitious. Young Jean-Lannes springs immediately to mind. While alongside him was Joseph Sulkowski, a bold cavalry officer. The Franco-Polish relationship, even at this early stage, was strong. Even the old Bourbon kings had nominally supported the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and after its third and final partition only the year prior, thousands of Polish exiles had joined up with the Revolutionary Army. Another Polish exile, Desideri Klimkowski, served as one of Napoleon's aides-de-camp during the campaign. The other guy worth mentioning is Gerard Duroc. Duroc came recommended from his prior service, and for his excellent handling of artillery. Indeed, alongside Napoleon, Duroc was one of the few properly trained artillerymen the French had in Italy. Pretty quickly, he was indispensable to Napoleon. I'm in a rage with everyone in Milan. Nothing gets to me. No artillery, no officers, no gunners. I am sending now Duroc to stir things up. In the present situation, days equal centuries. There is a company of artillery which I expected last century. They are all dead on the road, I suppose, as I haven't heard a word from them. Napoleon's exasperation is palpable, and things were only going to get worse. By July 17th, the siege artillery arrived and was positioned on the northern side of Mantua. The bombardment commenced and covered a pretty daring assault launched on the night of the 18th. Led by Marat, boats laden with soldiers glided across Lake Mantua, but only to find that the tide had ebbed. The boats skidded to a grinding halt about halfway, literally in the middle of the lake. If it hadn't been nighttime, there's little chance the assault teams would have made it back in one piece, Marat included. So the job of capitulating Mantua was now left solely up to the artillery. From well-sighted batteries, they pounded away at Mantua. Quote, 2 batteries firing a red-hot shot, Napoleon regaled to Josephine. Quote, the wretched city was blazing, a horrible but grand spectacle. However, after over a week's bombardment, Mantua was still no closer to surrender. And word had arrived from Messina. Wurmser was marching south. Reinforced by units earmarked for the German campaign, the Austrian army was up to a strength of 50,000. They were separated out into 3 corps. The main force, the strongest at 32,000, was personally led by Wurmser and raced down the eastern side of the Adige towards Lake Garda. Further to his east was a smaller reserve corps which exited the Brenta Valley. On the western side of the Adige was General Peter von Kvosdanovic, a Croatian-born general of little renown but decades of experience. He had with him the remaining 18,000 men. Each of the Austrian corps marched in columns. Wurmser's own force marched in 5 separate columns, and though this would speed things up, it left them vulnerable, unable to offer mutual support when the going got tough. But these worries were a ways off for now, because initially, all would go well for Wurmser. Reports of the offensive reached Napoleon late in the day of July 28th. His reaction was swift and decisive. He gave Sertorio orders to prepare to abandon the siege, should his division be needed. Then the army of Italy was rallied and faced northwards in a long line to blunt Wurmser's momentum. At dawn on the 29th, the first Austrian columns impacted the French line. General Pierre-François Sorel, Le Havre's official replacement, and a veteran of the Pyrenees campaign, was expected to hold pretty well in the hills around the town of Charlot. And to begin, the French defence was tenacious, with Charlot changing hands 3 times. But as Kozdanovich's superior numbers were brought to bear, Sorel withdrew, having sustained heavy losses in men and cannons. On the eastern side of the line, Wormser's advance guard made contact with Massena's division at around the same time. In a running battle lasting well into the night, Massena was beaten back from Rivoli down to Bussoleno. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, but again, superior numbers clinched the win for the Austrians. By nightfall, the situation seemed stable, even if morale was ebbing. Napoleon consoled Massena, quote, "Fear not, for what we've lost today shall be recovered tomorrow. Nothing is lost while courage remains." Were it so simple? Napoleon expected fighting to resume at daybreak, whereupon he would counterattack towards Rivoli. Augereau was ordered on an exhausting 60-mile march to the east, but this meant that the left flank would be perilously exposed. Napoleon was betting that Wormser's main effort would come from the east, a miscalculation that would cost the French dearly. Using Napoleon's own tactics against him, Kostanovich made a daring thrust during the night, cutting behind the French lines from the northwest. On the 30th, confusion reigned among the French, as Kostanovich seized Brescia with incredible ease. This was a bad spot to be in, but one that Napoleon knew an immediate and spirited counteroffensive could break him out of. The French still dominated a central position, from which the numerically superior but divided Austrian pincers could be dealt with separately. The immediate goal was to strengthen the centre by retaking Brescia, and then, at all costs, prevent Kostanovich and Wormser from converging. Augereau was the first to be put into the attack. His orders spelled out the French predicament. "The army's unfortunate position is this, that the enemy have broken through our lines at 3 points. They hold Rivoli. Massena and Joubert had to retreat. Sorel had fallen back on Desenzano. The enemy has taken Brescia. Our communications to Milan are cut. Await new orders in Rovabella. I will join you there." To aid his counterblow, Napoleon ordered Serrurier to spike or bury his guns, and at least 179 were later discovered by the Mantua garrison. His division was then put into the fight, with 2 brigades used to reinforce Massena and Augereau. Of the 2 Austrian columns, Napoleon decided to focus his main effort on Kozdanovich's western one. At 3 a.m. on July 31st, the army of Italy marched northwest towards the small town of Lonato. Already, Sorel was buckling under a severe Austrian attack. In the First Battle of Lonato, Napoleon arrived just in time to avert disaster. At the head of the 32nd Demi Brigade, Massena threatened Ott's left as Augereau's cavalry and artillery harried him from the right. He would be back, but for now, Kozdanovich fell back during the night. By then, Napoleon was again on the move, galloping west to Brescia ahead of Augereau's division. Brescia was largely retaken by August 2nd. General d'Epinoy was left to defend, meaning that Napoleon and Augereau could rejoin the main force near Lonato. By this stage, the French were eager to avenge their defeats, as was Napoleon. His army was properly assembled and ready to deal a stinging blow to Kozdanovich. In recounting events to Salicetti, Napoleon was certain he'd be victorious soon. For a moment, fortune appeared to have turned against us. But at last, thanks to the Battle of Lonato and my vigorous measures, things are beginning to look better. I have raised the siege of Mantua, and nearly all the army is here with me. I shall seize the first opportunity of engaging the enemy, and thereby settle the fate of Italy. We've had reverses, but victory is inclined to rejoin our standards." Victory rejoined the French standards the next morning. Wormser was nowhere to be seen. He'd spent July 30th to August 2nd relieving Mantua, and then sat on his hands in a defensive line. As had been the case for weeks, Austrian inaction would cost them far more than any individual tactical setback. By the time he set out, on the morning of August 3rd, it was already too late to save Kozdanovich. The Battle of Second Lonato began with skirmishing around Castiglione. Augereau's division stood between Wormser and Massena. For the entire day, Augereau's division held like a rock. Successive waves of Austrian attackers blasted to bits and forced to withdraw. The division then counterattacked and retook the area just west of Castiglione. Massena's division was just as successful. Kozdanovich made some progress into Lonato and even routed an entire French brigade. But in the afternoon, Massena launched a counterattack toward Gorado, while Napoleon took the 32nd Demi Brigade and elements of the 18th Line and personally led them into Lonato. A vicious bayonet charge broke Austrian resolve. They withdrew north, but strayed right into a French flanking force led by Junot. The subsequent fighting was extremely fierce, and Junot received 6 cuts to his head from Austrian sabres. By late afternoon, the entire Austrian division surrendered to Junot. All told, Quosdanovich had lost around 5,000 men and several dozen guns. Wormser's own losses numbered in the low thousands, and he was down to about 25,000 effectives. Sertorigo had defeated 4,000 reinforcements dispatched from Mantua, meant to bolster these meagre numbers. This was Sertorigo's penultimate act before returning to France on account of debilitating sickness. Command of his division would temporarily pass to General Pasquale Fiorella. With Quosdanovich's pincer destroyed, it only remained for the army to focus all attentions on Wormser. Wormser's line was fairly dense, but vulnerable. He was waiting for what was left of Quosdanovich's force to arrive from the north, so all there was to do in the meantime was hold Castiglione, and with Napoleon's 30,000 men now exhausted after days of hard fighting, Wormser did not expect this to be a challenge. After recuperating for a day, Napoleon launched his attack on August 5th. Augereau's division took the centre, Massena the left, and General Kilmaine with the cavalry on the far right. A cascade of French columns assailed Wormser's line late in the morning, capturing Solferino and Castiglione. After these successes, Massena began to vacate Solferino. Wormser dispatched a chunk of his reserve to chase him down, but in so doing, fell into Napoleon's cleverly laid trap. With his reserve committed, Wormser was completely defenceless when General Fiorella descended upon his rear lines. French dragoons and hussars ravaged the Austrian rear, capturing cannon and looting a baggage train. In desperation, Wormser ordered a general retreat. This operation went much better for the Austrians. Though elated, the French were completely exhausted. They managed to capture a few hundred Austrians and several cannons, but the vast majority of Wormser's army escaped intact, though at one stage, the general himself was very nearly captured. For the loss of around 1,000 men, Napoleon had inflicted 3 times as many losses, taken plenty more cannon, and put Wormser on the run. Austrian losses for their failed offensive thus far, Napoleon estimated at 70 guns, all their transports, 12,000 to 15,000 prisoners, and 6,000 killed and wounded. The number of prisoners is quite a bit inflated, but there can be little doubt that this was a masterful reversal. Mantua had been relieved, yes, but after defeating a superior enemy in detail, Napoleon still held the field and the initiative. For now, Italy was well and truly his. On the night of the 5th, when walking through the battlefield, as he liked to do, Napoleon had an encounter which he later recorded in his diary. The moonlight was lovely. Suddenly, from out of the deep solitude of the night, a dog, crawling from under his dead master's cloak, lunged at us, but only to quickly return to his lair, howling plaintively. He licked his master's face, and then turned on us again. It seemed as though we both asked for help, and cried out for vengeance. Whether it was my mood, or the place, the hour, the incident itself, perhaps even something unaccountable, I know not what exactly, but I can truly say that nothing on a battlefield had ever moved me so much. Involuntarily, I stopped to watch. Perhaps, I said to myself, the man has friends, and he lies here abandoned by all but his dog. What a lesson for nature to read us, through the love of a dog. We've talked about the Italian campaign thus far, in terms of cities taken and casualties sustained, but it's important to remember the human cost. It's episodes like this one, which Napoleon made a note of only for his own recollection, that show how well aware he was of the pain and suffering of war. But there wasn't time to dwell. Before long, morning arrived, and as the sun rose above Castiglione, the French army set out once more.